The light of dawn softly spills into the humble cottage, the golden rays filtering through the cracks and casting gentle beams across the rough straw mat. This small hut, nestled on the edge of medieval farmlands, is silent and ancient, filled with the earthy scent of damp soil. Outside, the endless fields stretch far into the horizon, with the fresh morning breeze carrying the fragrances of earth and crops. Inside, however, the atmosphere is different, quiet, tense, as if waiting for an imminent change. That night, the cold and darkness were finally pierced by the loud cry of an infant. The mother's breath was quick, her grip tight on her husband's hand, her eyes filled with pain and anxiety. But as the child's cries grew louder, the tension in the air began to loosen. It was the birth of a child, a new life, entering this world with the hopes of its parents and the expectations of the village. The woman's face was slick with sweat, but she slowly lifted her head, gazing at the first rays of sunlight that crept through the window. The small cottage was simply furnished, wooden boards for walls, the floor covered with rough straw. There were no luxurious fabrics, no elegant ceremonies, only the arrival of a new life. The baby, wrapped gently in its mother's arms, had tears on its face, but her eyes radiated deep love and comfort. Her husband, still gripping her hand, looked exhausted, but his gaze was full of endless affection. They were not nobles, nor merchants, they were just two simple farmers who lived by the land and through their labor. Even without the help of a doctor, without warm caretakers around, life still found its way into the world. Outside, the village remained quiet, occasionally interrupted by the distant barking of dogs and crowing of chickens. This small village, scattered across the vast fields, was far removed from the noise and bustle of the city. Most of its residents were farmers, toiling in the fields day after day, leading lives that were poor yet simple and fulfilling. Every villager lived an ordinary life, until one day their names fade into the sands of time. Much like this baby's birth, ordinary, yet carrying the weight of countless futures. The baby's cries began to soften, becoming gentler, as if telling the world it was ready to face the challenges of life. The mother's weary face broke into a tender smile. Her husband lowered his head and kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with gratitude and tenderness. Their child had been born, this was the future of their family, beginning to grow in that tiny body. In this warm dawn, a new life arrived, carrying the light of hope. It may not be remembered by history, its name might be forgotten by time, but it carries with it the future of this family, the village, and the whole community. This child will live through the cycle of growth, labor, faith, love, and death, becoming part of the land and witnessing the struggles and resilience of medieval peasants' lives. As the night gradually faded and the first rays of sunlight filled the room, it felt as if the whole world was quietly blessing the child's birth. It was not just a celebration for a family, but the beginning of a life that connects the past with the future, life with death, and eternity. On this barren land, the village, bathed in the sunlight of dawn, seems like an ancient stone slab worn by the winds of time. The air in the early morning is filled with the scent of dew and wet earth, and the sounds of children's laughter and footsteps echo through the fields. The fields are not empty, they are alive with the pulse of nature, from the breathing of cattle to the growth of crops, everything here is deeply rooted. The boy's childhood was not one of wealth, but it was rich in experience. His skin, darkened by the sun, wore clothes sewn from rough cloth, already covered in mud and straw, like an extension of the land itself. His feet often sank into the muddy paths, the earth beneath them seeming to open into an endless chasm. Each step was a new challenge, yet he never complained. Every morning, he ran through the fields with the other children. There were no toys, no entertainment, just nature's elements becoming their playground. Sticks were made into swords and bows, as they chased the birds that flew above, or played by the river, mimicking the work of adults, plowing, drawing water, as if preparing for the heavy burdens of adulthood. The land itself seemed to have its own rhythm. Spring was the time for sowing, summer for growth, autumn for harvest, and winter was the quiet of the earth. The boy's childhood was intimately tied to these changing seasons. He learned to recognize the moisture of the soil, to plant in spring, water in summer, and harvest in autumn. No longer the infant cradled in his mother's arms, he became a small laborer, shaped by the land and the labor required to sustain his family. Each autumn, the village would hold a collective celebration to mark the harvest, and though it was not a luxurious festival, for the boy, it was the liveliest time of the year. The whole village would be filled with song, laughter, and the rich smells of food, as neighbors exchanged grains, tools, and stories. Even the poorest families could feel the warmth of unity on this day. The boy would run to the village tavern and sip the homemade apple cider his mother brewed, the sweet tart taste becoming one of his fondest memories of childhood. Yet, the land was not always kind. When the rainy season arrived, floods would mercilessly sweep through the village, drowning fields and destroying homes. The boy, along with the other children, would rush to the dike to watch as the water levels rose, filled with awe and helplessness at the power of nature. After each flood, the villagers would rebuild with muddy hands and weary bodies, and this cycle became an inevitable part of his life. In this land, children never knew carefree days. Even in moments of joy, the worry and exhaustion in their parents' eyes always reminded them that life was never truly easy. There was never enough food, the winter cold was bone-chilling, and the spring sowing season was filled with anxiety and hope. Yet these struggles were an integral part of his life, woven into his very being, shaping his journey toward the future. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, he would stand on a small hill at the edge of the village and look out at the sunset. A sense of longing would rise in his chest, despite the village's smallness and the simplicity of life. He believed that this land, though harsh, had an immense power. The fields, the forests, the rivers, all of nature seemed to quietly nourish him and every other resident of this village. In his eyes, the world seemed vast, and though he was but a speck of dust on this land, he could feel the profound power of nature. He, along with his family and village, was a small part of this great earth. No longer the infant crying in his mother's arms, he was now a child, grounded in this land, filled with the hopes of the future. Every step he took in the muddy fields was a step toward the future. And though it would be a life filled with labor and sweat, each step brought him closer to the inevitable end of the journey. Despite this, the joy and pain of childhood intertwined, shaping his life in this ancient land. In the medieval countryside, the night sky always seems to be especially vast, with stars shining like countless bright eyes, watching over the ancient land. As night falls, everything in the village quiets down. Only the occasional rustling of wind and distant barking of dogs can be heard. The villagers retire early, but for the young boy, this time of day is filled with mystery. Every night, he would snuggle into his mother's arms and listen to the stories about saints and deities, his imagination vividly bringing to life the great heroes and gods. His mother's voice was soft and warm, telling tales of the Garden of Eden, of how God created the world, and of the saints who guided people toward righteousness. Behind each story, there was an invisible force that pulled the boy in. The desire for the unknown, the curiosity about the mystical world, took root deep in his heart, becoming a seed for his future thoughts on life and fate. In the village, almost every household had similar traditions. Every night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, the elders would sit in wooden chairs, gathering the children around them, and softly narrating the ancient legends. These stories spoke of the creation by gods or of the heroes from the village's history. Every villager's life seemed intertwined with these stories. They believed that these myths were not just tales, they represented the origin of the world and the connection between humans and the divine. The boy would often lie on his mother's lap, his eyes bright with eagerness to hear the stories. He listened intently, memorizing the names of each god and the exploits of the heroes. Sometimes, in his dreams, he would run alongside the characters from those myths, fighting battles and living adventures. The warriors and goddesses from the stories seemed to become a part of his very soul. He began to understand that life wasn't just about daily labor, sowing, and reaping. There was a deeper meaning to existence, a connection to the gods, a touch with forces beyond the earthly realm. Once a year, the village would hold rituals to express their respect and gratitude toward the gods. Though the ceremonies were simple, to the boy, they were sacred symbols of divine presence. The candles lit on the altar, the scent of offerings, and the echoing sound of the church bells created an atmosphere of reverence. Standing among the crowd, the boy would fixate on the priest's figure, feeling as if the whole world had quieted down and only the sacred energy enveloped him. Religion held an unshakable place in this small village. It wasn't just a belief system, it was the foundation of life's rules. It was the source of strength for villagers who prayed for the well-being of themselves and their families. In these everyday rituals and stories, the line between the sacred and the mundane seemed to blur. Everyone longed to connect with the gods, seeking their protection and blessings. This belief wasn't only about securing peace in the afterlife, but also about explaining the hardships and hopes of life, searching for meaning and direction in their everyday existence. The boy often spent quiet evenings gazing at the stars, filled with questions in his mind. Could he, too, become one of the heroes from those stories? Could he bear the hopes of his village, become a source of pride for his parents and the villagers? These thoughts began to take root in his heart, driving him in the coming years to find his own answers in life. Whenever he recalled the stories his mother had told him, the images of the gods and the deeds of the heroes would stir his soul. He began to dream of the future, yearning for the courage and wisdom of the figures in the tales. He realized that he wasn't merely living in a poor village, he was part of a world filled with magic and power, where endless possibilities awaited him. The scent of spring filled the air as the warm sunlight bathed the fields, and the fragrance of soil and new shoots lingered in the breeze. The young boy stood at the edge of the field, his eyes focused on the land gradually turning green in the distance. His heart was filled with anticipation for what the future held. Each year, spring is the most important season for the farm. It is the time when all hopes rest on the seed sprouting and the land yielding its bounty. This year, he was 14, an age when, according to village customs, he was ready to take on more responsibility. His father handed him a small plow, its weight heavy enough to make him almost lose his balance. His mother stood nearby, quietly watching him, her eyes full of hope. In that moment, the boy felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, an invisible pressure that almost took his breath away. But he knew, this was a part of his life, something every farm boy had to face to grow up. "Begin, child," his father's voice was low and steady, his gaze never leaving the distant fields. His mother sighed softly, turning to prepare lunch. She knew what this moment meant. It marked the time when a child begins to step out of the home and into the fields, moving from dependence to independence. The plow's handle gleamed, worn smooth by years of use, and his young hands gripped it tightly, the only connection between him and the earth. The boy lowered his gaze to the soil, a nervous tension building inside him. The land was not kind, it was hard, filled with thorns and hardships, but it also gave life, it gave hope. Spring was the hardest season, and the farmers, through their labor during this time, carried all their hopes for the future. Every seed was a risk, and every swing of the plow was a challenge to nature. As the plow dug into the soil, the thick smell of earth filled his senses, as if the land itself was responding to his effort. His hands began to blister, and beads of sweat slid down his forehead, but he did not stop. His heart raced faster, but his steps remained steady. He knew this was a rite of passage, a crucial step in his journey toward maturity. The chirping of birds and the whisper of the wind blended together, as if the whole world was cheering him on. In this ancient land, he was not the only boy to experience this spring plowing ritual. Almost every boy in the village had gone through it. No one would pay special attention to his efforts, and no one would cheer him on because, in the end, this was just a part of life, a part of the endless cycle of the farm. And yet, despite it all, the young boy's heart was still filled with dreams. He imagined the future, picturing himself as an accomplished farmer, like his father, changing the land with hard work and sweat. Though he knew that this dream wouldn't be easy to achieve, he still believed that only through diligence and effort could he experience the joy of a fruitful harvest and the hope that life could offer. The day's labor came to an end as dusk fell, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the fields. The boy stood on the embankment, looking at the land he had just plowed, his chest swelling with pride. He knew this was just the beginning. There were many more challenges ahead. But no matter what, he had taken the first step and carried the responsibility of his family, of the village, on his shoulders. The scent of his mother's cooking began to drift from the house, and the fatigue in his body was met with the warm call of home. He placed the plow down and began walking back toward the house. Each step was heavy, but each step also made him more determined. The land, the responsibility, it had become a part of his life, something etched into his very being, something he could never forget. The annual market and festival had arrived, and in this quiet village, there was almost nothing that could break the peacefulness and stillness of everyday life, but this moment held a different kind of excitement and anticipation. Early in the morning, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the land around the village began to slowly wake up. The air was filled with the scent of earth and spices, as if every breeze carried the spirit of the festival. The boy walked eagerly with his father toward the market, their steps quick but filled with excitement. The market, located in the center of the village, was transformed from its usual calm square into a lively, bustling space. Stalls of every kind lined the streets, and the vendors' calls blended into a unique festive melody. "Hurry up, son, we can't miss the festival," his father's voice cut through the bustle, reminding him to get to the place of the ritual. The market wasn't just a place to trade grains and goods, it was more a gathering for socializing and celebration. Each year, the entire village came together to mark the harvest and ask for the gods' blessings for the coming year. The boy wove through the crowd, his eyes drawn to the colorful stalls. There were freshly ground flour, spices, handmade crafts, and an assortment of fruits and vegetables. Villagers exchanged goods, greeted each other, and smiled warmly. Life in the village was simple and monotonous, but on this day, there was a liveliness that stirred his soul, filling the air with energy. On the other side of the market, preparations for the ritual were underway. The priests stood in front of the temple, dressed in magnificent robes, holding incense burners and golden ritual implements. The flames of the sacrifice flickered in the wind, and the smoke filled the air with a sacred and mysterious aura. Every year, the villagers would take part in this solemn ceremony, offering respect to the gods and praying for a prosperous and peaceful year. The boy stood amidst the crowd, feeling a sense of awe at everything unfolding before him. His eyes were fixed on the offerings placed on the altar, flowers, fruits, spices, and gold objects, all symbolizing abundance and the divine. The priests began chanting their prayers, their voices deep and melodic, as if pulling everyone's spirit into a sacred space. The boy felt a rush of reverence, as if he could feel the presence of the God surrounding them, watching over everything. This day was not only the village's festive day, but it also marked a turning point for the boy, a day when he began to truly understand the importance of religion and faith in daily life. The sacredness of the ritual, the bustling of the market, and the laughter of the villagers made him feel that his fate was intimately tied to the village's. On this festival day, everyone's heart was filled with hope and expectation. Although their lives were still poor, in that moment, they all felt as though the gods had blessed them, and the future seemed full of infinite possibilities. At the end of the festival, the villagers gathered in the central square to share a simple but hearty meal. The smell of roasted meat and bread filled the air as people raised their cups, toasting the harvest and celebrating the fruits of their labor. It wasn't a lavish feast, but the warmth and camaraderie shared by everyone made it feel like a grand celebration. The boy sat with his parents around the fire, enjoying the simple joys of family and community. This moment, these gatherings, were priceless. They allowed people to forget about the struggles of everyday life, as if the God's blessings made everything feel beautiful and full of hope. As night descended, the noise of the market gradually quieted, but the laughter and joy of the villagers lingered in the air. The boy returned home, lying in bed, still thinking about the events of the day. He knew that next year, the same festival, the same market, and the same celebration would return. And he, too, would continue to work the land, bringing hope and prosperity to his family and the village. The summer air was hot and heavy, the sun pouring down its scorching rays, while the village streets filled with the fragrance of wheat fields and fresh grass. Today, the entire village seemed unusually busy. The normally quiet streets were now filled with people, as almost every household had someone involved in the special event, the wedding of the youngest couple in the village. The boy walked eagerly with his father toward the market, their steps quick but filled with excitement. The market, usually a quiet spot in the center of the village, was now transformed into a lively, bustling space. Stalls of all kinds lined the streets, and the calls of vendors mixed together, creating a festive melody. "Hurry up, son, we can't miss the ceremony," his father's voice broke through the market's clamor, reminding him to get to the ritual site. The market was more than just a place for exchanging grain and goods, it was a social gathering, a celebration. Each year, the whole village came together to celebrate the harvest and pray for the God's blessings in the coming year. The boy weaved through the crowd, his eyes drawn to the colorful stalls. There were freshly ground flour, spices, handmade crafts, and a variety of fruits and vegetables. Villagers exchanged goods, greeted each other, and smiled warmly. Life in the village was simple and monotonous, but on this day, there was an energy, a liveliness that stirred him. On the other side of the market, preparations for the ceremony were already underway. The priests stood in front of the temple, dressed in splendid robes, holding incense burners and golden ritual instruments. The flames of the sacrifice flickered in the wind, and smoke filled the air with a sacred and mysterious aura. Every year, the villagers took part in this solemn ritual, paying respect to the gods and praying for a prosperous and peaceful year. The boy stood in the crowd, feeling a deep sense of awe at everything around him. His eyes fixed on the offerings placed on the altar, flowers, fruits, spices, and golden objects, all symbols of abundance and divinity. The priests began chanting their prayers, their voices deep and melodic, as if pulling everyone's spirit into a sacred space. The boy felt a rush of reverence, as though he could feel the gods' presence surrounding them, watching over everything. This day wasn't just the village's festival, it also marked a turning point for the boy. It was the day he began to truly understand the importance of religion and faith in daily life. The sacredness of the ritual, the bustle of the market, and the villagers' laughter made him feel that his fate was intimately tied to the village's. On this festival day, everyone's heart was filled with hope and expectation. Although their lives were still hard, in this moment, they all felt as though the gods had blessed them, and the future seemed full of infinite possibilities. At the end of the ceremony, the villagers gathered in the central square to share a simple but hearty meal. The smell of roasted meats and bread filled the air as people raised their cups, toasting the harvest and celebrating the fruits of their labor. It wasn't a lavish feast, but the warmth and camaraderie shared by everyone made it feel like a grand celebration. The boy sat with his parents around the fire, enjoying the simple joys of family and community. These moments, these gatherings, were priceless. They allowed people to forget about the struggles of everyday life, as if the gods' blessings made everything feel beautiful and full of hope. As night descended, the noise of the market gradually faded, but the laughter and joy of the villagers lingered in the air. The boy returned home, lying in bed, still thinking about the events of the day. He knew that next year, the same festival, the same market, and the same celebration would return. And he, too, would continue to work the land, bringing hope and prosperity to his family and the village. The autumn dusk descended slowly, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting golden light across the fields of the village. The air was thick with the scent of ripened grains and hay. Most of the villagers were busy in the fields, some harvesting crops, others clearing away the last of the weeds, while the boy and his father had come early to prepare the soil for the next spring's planting. This year's harvest isn't as good as it has been in the past. His father's voice was heavy with concern as he plunged the plow into the soil. The boy stood by, watching his father's movements, a growing sense of worry filling his chest. At this time of year, there was always a certain tension in the village, especially when the harvest wasn't as bountiful. The grain stores were low, and the villagers began to worry. Would they have enough food to survive the winter? Would the cold months bring famine? Father, will we have enough food for next year? The boy asked softly, his eyes full of unease. We have no choice, his father replied calmly, yet with a hint of helplessness in his voice. Every year, we sow seeds into the land, hoping for a good harvest. But sometimes, even when we've done everything we can, the weather doesn't cooperate. He paused, looking out toward the horizon, his gaze distant. We can only pray for the gods' blessing. This land, once fertile, had seen its share of devastation, floods, droughts, and pestilence that had at times left the village on the brink of ruin. When the harvest fell short, the villagers began to panic. The shadow of famine always loomed over their lives, an invisible chain that kept them in a state of perpetual unease. The boy clearly remembered last winter, when the village had endured a terrible famine. The snow had covered the earth, the cold winds had howled, and the grain stores were nearly empty. His parents had used almost all their reserve food, even selling off livestock to buy what little they could find. Yet, even with all their efforts, many people hadn't survived the cold months. The village had fallen silent during that time, the air thick with anxiety and despair. "We must plant," his father's voice broke through the boy's thoughts, "even if the weather doesn't help, we must still try. Life has never been easy, and hardship will always come, but it's only those who persevere who will survive." His father's words felt like a force, pushing through the boy's unease. Life had never been easy, but his father's resilience gave him a deep sense of hope. No matter how tough it was, life would go on, and the season of sowing would come once again. That evening, the family sat down to a simple meal: black bread, cheese, and a bowl of thin porridge. The table wasn't laden with grand dishes, but it was warm with the light from the fire and the smiles of his parents. Even though the harvest had been poor this year, the unity and comfort of the family made the small home feel full of warmth. Despite the hardships of life, despite the uncertainty of the future, they still believed that, through hard work, they would make it through. "Next year, the spring will come," his mother said softly, her voice firm with resolve. "We will plant again." The boy lowered his head, silently agreeing with his mother's words. No matter what the future held, he understood that as a farmer, the meaning of life lay in the land, the seasons, and the hope of every autumn's sowing and every spring's renewal. He no longer feared famine, nor the darkness of the future, because he knew, as his father had said, that only those who persist will see the true harvest. As night fell, the village quieted once more. The boy lay in bed, gazing out through the window at the stars twinkling in the sky, as if distant gods were watching over their village. He closed his eyes, silently praying that next year, the land would respond to their labor, bringing forth the fruits of a prosperous harvest. The cold winter had arrived, and the village grew eerily silent, with only the occasional barking of a dog echoing down the empty streets. Most of the villagers had paused their work, gathering around the fire, exchanging quiet words about the harsh season ahead. The crackling flames lit up their faces, but in the air, there was more than just the scent of burning wood, there was an invisible fear, slowly seeping into everyone's lives. That year, a terrible plague had struck the village. It started with a few of the elderly falling ill, and soon more and more people began showing symptoms: fevers, coughing, weakness. Before long, the whole village was shrouded in gloom, with almost every household affected. The disease spread like an unseen pestilence, rapidly moving through the streets, leaving pain and fear in its wake. "Father, how is Mother?" the boy asked anxiously, his eyes filled with concern. His father paused for a moment, lowering his gaze to the herbs in his hands. Mother lay on the bed, pale and struggling to breathe, her hands cold to the touch. Despite the efforts of the village's elders, who had given her herbs and medicinal concoctions, the illness seemed relentless. The boy's father had always been strong and calm, but even now, his usual composure faltered as he prepared yet another remedy. "We'll manage," his father finally spoke, his voice low, "I will take care of her." The village, much like every other, had no doctors or hospitals. The only recourse was the use of traditional herbs and the remedies passed down through generations. There was an elderly woman in the village who knew the most about herbal medicine. She would visit every home, carrying her old wooden medicine box, filled with dried leaves, roots, and ointments. She worked quickly, her hands steady despite her age, as she mixed potions for those in need. Yet, even she was powerless to stop the disease's spread. She, too, could offer no more than what she had known for decades, but for this sickness, it wasn't enough. The boy could still vividly recall the famine that had struck the village last winter. The snow had buried the fields, and the freezing wind had cut through every crack in their homes. Food had been scarce, and families had barely managed to survive. Now, another disaster had arrived, this one invisible, more terrifying, and it seemed to have no mercy. "Father, hasn't the priest offered prayers?" The boy asked again, looking for some sort of comfort. "We must rely on ourselves as well," his father responded softly, his eyes firm. The villagers had held several prayer ceremonies, gathering in the church, calling upon the gods for their mercy. Yet, the disease continued to spread. The priests' prayers no longer held the power they once did. It was as if the gods were far away, their presence no longer felt. Just then, a stranger entered the village, a traveling doctor with a satchel full of herbs and medical knowledge. He was a middle-aged man, rugged and worn, with a simple pack slung over his back. He told the villagers that he had learned some herbal remedies from a nearby city, and although he wasn't formally trained in medicine, he had treatments that might help. His arrival brought a glimmer of hope. He treated the sick with his strange herbs, and slowly, many villagers began to recover. Although the disease did not disappear entirely, it seemed to lessen, and the village was able to catch its breath. The boy watched his parents grow stronger, and hope slowly returned to his heart. Despite the darkness of the plague, the villagers had come together. Although the disease could not be cured with herbs alone, their collective effort, along with the strength of those who cared for the sick, was what pulled them through. As the night fell, the plague's shadow seemed to lift, and the village returned to its quiet peace. The boy stood at the door of his home, looking up at the starry sky. His heart was full of gratitude. Life was always challenging, but as long as his family was healthy, and the village remained united, nothing could truly defeat them. The early winter winds carried a chill that settled deep into the bones, and the air was thick with the scent of frost. The streets of the village were lined with plumes of smoke rising from chimneys, as families huddled inside to prepare for the bitter cold ahead. The weather was harsh, but this season still held a glimmer of anticipation, yet today, the village felt heavier than usual. Because the tax collector had arrived. Every year around this time, the tax collector sent by the Lord would visit the village to collect the taxes, and the amount was often so burdensome that it made the lives of the peasants even harder. Today, the tax collector arrived with his heavy ledger and sacks of coin. The villagers knew that today would mark another day of increased strain. Taxes were not just a transaction of goods or money, they were an oppressive weight, and every farmer knew that they had no choice but to submit. "Today, it's your turn," the father's voice was low and serious as he stood by the door, looking toward the tax collector who was walking toward the village. The boy stood beside his father, a knot of worry growing in his chest. Every time the tax collector came, he saw the exhaustion and helplessness in his father's face. The taxes were always heavy, and every year, it seemed that the burden on the peasants grew. His father's hands were rough from years of hard labor, his body worn down by the unyielding land. Yet, despite the daily struggle, his father never seemed to complain, until the tax collector appeared, and then all the hard work seemed to be for naught. "I know," the boy whispered, though his heart was filled with frustration and anger. The Lord did not care about the survival of the peasants, they only cared about increasing their wealth. Each year, the taxes increased, directly affecting the lives of every farmer. The villagers worked tirelessly, but at the end of the year, the grain, livestock, and other products were handed over to the tax collectors. For the peasants, it felt like they were nothing more than tools for the Lord's benefit, with no power to change their fate or voice their grievances. The boy watched as his father walked toward the tax collector, his expression somber. The tax collector, dressed in fine clothes, looked down at the farmers with a cold, indifferent smile, his eyes scanning his ledger with swift precision. He didn't take notice of the farmers' struggles, all that mattered was collecting the required sum for the Lord. This year's harvest was poor, his father spoke softly, his voice betraying the weight of his words, "This is all we can give." The tax collector glanced up briefly, his eyes dismissive. "That's the rule. You pay what is required. The Lord does not concern himself with your hardships." In that moment, the boy saw the deep helplessness on his father's face, but his father said nothing more. He simply handed over a portion of their meager grain, offering it to the tax collector. Every sack of grain was a result of their year-long labor, every kernel was the family's lifeline. Yet now, these sacrifices had to be given away, just to satisfy the Lord's demands. The boy stood silently by, his heart filled with anger. He couldn't understand why the hard-working peasants had to endure such oppression. Why was it that no matter how hard they worked, they were always burdened with more and more hardship? Why was it that all of their struggles seemed to amount to nothing but more taxes and more silence? But despite his anger, he dared not speak out. For he knew, in this harsh world, the voices of the peasants were weak. He lowered his head and silently followed his father back to their home. Once they returned home, his father set the sacks of grain aside, his gaze distant as he looked out at the fields through the window. The boy sat quietly beside him, filled with admiration and sorrow. He knew that his father had worked the land his entire life, and yet, it seemed that nothing ever changed. Life was simple but fraught with endless pressures, and this weight, imposed by the Lord's taxes, was a part of that constant struggle. "Father, will this happen again next year?" The boy finally asked, his voice low with hope and uncertainty. "Probably, son," his father replied quietly. "But we have to keep going. No matter how hard it gets, we have to keep moving forward." The boy nodded, his heart full of questions and discontent. But he knew, as a farmer, his life was tied to the land, to the seasons, and to the cycle of sowing and reaping. Though he could not change the injustices that came with it, he knew that he must carry on, just as his father had, and face the challenges ahead. The cold winter finally passed, and the quiet arrival of spring embraced the village. The grasses in the fields began to turn green, and the air felt fresh as new life began to stir within the land. The villagers returned to their busy routines of planting, their animals regaining strength, and the rhythm of daily life resumed once more. Yet, beneath the calm surface, there was an undeniable sense of tension. This tension didn't come from the demands of the farm work, but from the distant war. A few weeks earlier, the villagers had heard rumors from passing traders that a large-scale war had broken out to the north. The king's army and the enemy forces were clashing along the border, with the flames of battle creeping steadily southward. While the village was far from the front lines, everyone knew that the threat of war was getting closer. I heard the fire of war has reached the northern bank of the river. The enemy forces are moving fast, the village elder murmured as he shared the news at the market, his face marked with worry. The boy's father stood at the doorway, his gaze focused on the distant horizon. There was a look of contemplation in his eyes. He had heard these rumors before, but each time, he gripped his hands tighter, unable to shake off the growing unease. The shadow of war was approaching, and all he could do was continue farming, continue living. Yet, facing this uncertainty, fear began to gnaw at his heart. "Father, what will we do if the war comes here?" The boy asked, his voice tinged with unease and curiosity. The question lingered in his mind. What did it mean if the war arrived? It meant destruction, death, the unraveling of the peaceful life they knew. "We can only wait," his father replied softly, his voice deep. "We can't change what happens far away. Let's just hope the gods protect us." But just as the villagers grew anxious about the coming war, one evening, news came that made everything even more tense. The vanguard of the enemy army was approaching the village, and the king's forces had sent patrols to intercept them. The fire of war seemed to be getting dangerously close, and the village atmosphere grew heavy with fear. Everyone's hearts were laden with the same heavy burden, afraid there would be nowhere to escape. However, the war did not come. Days passed, and the village learned that the enemy army had clashed with the king's forces not far from their homes, but due to a lack of supplies, they had been forced to retreat. The smoke of battle didn't reach the village, and peace returned, at least for the moment. Still, the villagers knew this peace was not permanent. War was like a beast lying in the shadows, ready to strike at any moment. Their lives, though momentarily spared, were always under its looming threat. Even as they escaped disaster for now, the shadow of war had firmly taken root in their hearts. "We must keep living," his father said softly. "Even if everything is destroyed, we must continue." The boy looked at his father's resolute back, a complex mix of admiration and fear stirring inside him. His father's strength was something to be admired, but the fear brought by the possibility of war made him feel small. The world, he realized, wasn't as peaceful or beautiful as he once thought. Every piece of land could hide flames of war and bloodshed. And he, like everyone else, could never escape the weight of history. That night, the village returned to its quiet peace. The stars still shone in the sky, as if nothing had changed. But in the boy's heart, something had shifted, a seed of doubt had been planted. It was the uncertainty of the future, the fear of life and death, and a deep understanding of what life truly meant. The sunset slowly descended across the sky, casting golden light over the fields, with long shadows stretching across the land. The old boy, perhaps now a man, still stood at the edge of the field, staring at the land before him. This land had been with him throughout his life, witnessing his growth, struggles, love, and pain. Now, with the passing of time, it still silently awaited him. Every patch of earth he had turned, every seed he had sown, carried his sweat and hope. He lowered his gaze to his hands, now rough and weathered, the years marking deep grooves on his skin. The hands that had once been nimble were now stiff, and the muscles that once moved with ease now seemed to protest with every motion. His body, once full of vigor, was slowly nearing its end, and every part of him was a reminder of the passage of time. The fields were the same, but everything had changed. Every spring, he would still walk to the fields with his sons, but now, the land no longer held just his shadow. The boy who had once been young was now old, and his children had grown, formed their own families, and taken on the responsibility and honor of the land. Yet, despite the years passing, he knew he was still the master here, even if the years had made him more silent, more frail. "Father, don't you want to rest as the sun sets?" His son's voice came from behind, filled with concern. The old man smiled faintly, turning to look at his grown son. Even though his sons had long since become adults, with families and their own responsibilities, they still took the time to remind him to rest. "No, child. I've gotten used to staying here. You go ahead, I've already prepared dinner." His son nodded, turning to leave, but the old man remained standing by the field, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The evening light bathed his silver hair, casting long shadows across his face. This moment was a part of his life, as if time had stopped, and only he and the land remained, eternally connected. Memories surged within him, flashing like scenes from a film. The difficult days, the years spent fighting for survival, those were the footprints of his life. In his youth, he had always been full of passion, dreaming of changing the world. Yet, time had worn away his sharp edges and shown him that changing the world was never simple, that the meaning of life wasn't in grand ambitions, but in the quiet perseverance of each day. The true meaning was found in patience, in resilience, in the struggle with life and, eventually, the reconciliation with it. He still remembered the first day he planted seeds. Back then, like every young farmer, he had been filled with hope and dreams, hoping the land would reward their hard work. And now, standing here on this familiar land, he no longer worried about the harvest. What mattered was not the amount, but the simple peace that had settled in his heart. The land had given him everything, and now, as his body grew old, it would continue to provide. In time, he would return to the earth, just as his ancestors had done before him. Old now, he whispered to himself with a smile. The light from the sunset gradually faded, and the evening sky turned to a soft, oil-painting-like hue. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying the scent of earth, mingling with the fresh smell of grass. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the heartbeat of the land beneath his feet. No matter how life changed, this land remained, its rhythm eternal, bearing the hopes and dreams of generations. As night fell, the village slowly returned to silence. He rose slowly, making his way back home. The lights inside his home had already flickered on, and his sons and wife were sitting together around the table, laughing and chatting. Even though his body was tired, even though his steps were slower, he knew that as long as he could return to this warm little home, everything was worth it. As he walked home, he thought about many things. The meaning of life, perhaps, lay in this land, perhaps it lay in the simplicity of one day after another. Whether in the struggles of youth or the quiet of old age, in the end, all of it would become a part of the years, a mark on his life, shaping his journey. The autumn air carried a chill, and the crops in the fields were ripe, the rice and wheat bending under the weight of their grains, as if they were telling the story of the year's toil and hope. The small village was bathed in golden sunlight, and the scent of the harvest filled every corner. All the farmers were busy in the fields, swinging their sickles and gathering the fruits of the year's labor. And in a corner of these fields, the figure of the old man still stood tall, his eyes filled not with fear, but with deep satisfaction and peace. This year, despite a few setbacks from storms and rain, the harvest was good overall. Even though his body was growing weaker with age, he still insisted on being personally involved in the planting and harvesting of every piece of land. Every grain of rice, every stalk of wheat, was a testament to his lifelong effort. At this moment, standing on this land, he felt a sense of calm and fulfillment unlike any he had ever known before. He gazed into the distance, where the fields seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The green stalks and golden wheat intertwined into a beautiful tapestry. In his heart, this land was more than just a source of survival, it was the place that held all his memories and dreams. These fields had watched him grow from a boy into the elderly man he was now. The rhythm of planting and harvesting had been the pulse of his life. Though his body had grown old, he still felt the heartbeat of the land, as if every seed that had been sown responded to the work he had put in. Every year's labor seemed to be remembered by the earth, transforming into the bountiful harvest he now witnessed. It was his gift to this land, his final offering of a life spent working its soil. This year's harvest is good, he said to himself, a smile forming on his face. While he knew it hadn't been easy, seeing the fruits of his labor brought a peace and fulfillment to his heart that was irreplaceable. Yet, there was a sense of regret that lingered in the old man's heart. His sons had grown up, established their own families, and started their own lives. Although they came back to help now and then, the responsibility for the land had largely shifted from him to them. He knew that, someday, he would no longer be able to work the fields. His hands, once so familiar with the tools of the land, would no longer grasp the plow or sickle. The sun began to set, and twilight descended upon the village. The work of the harvest was drawing to a close. The old man put away his tools and began his slow walk back to the house. It was a simple cottage with wooden doors and windows, the warmth of the fire flickering through the windows, inviting him in. His wife was already waiting inside, the table set with a simple meal, and the warmth of their family filled the room as they sat together, chatting and laughing, enjoying the end of another day. The harvest was good today, his wife said with a smile, her eyes full of tenderness. Yes, the old man nodded slowly, sitting down. He looked at his weathered hands, his voice low but filled with a deep satisfaction. "This is the last harvest of my life," he said, his words firm but calm. Though old and knowing his time was limited, in this moment, he knew he had completed his life's mission. The land was his home, his steadfast companion, and the meaning of his life. No matter what the future held, in this moment, he was at peace with the land, with his family, and with himself. As the fire crackled and his family's laughter filled the room, the old man closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of this moment. He knew his journey was nearing its end, but no matter what came next, this land, this family, and this sense of peace would stay with him until the very last moment.